Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another TASC podcast. This is where we talk about important issues and topics that are facing the UK's ambulance family today. My name is Karl Demian, and I'm the CEO at the ambulance staff charity, or TASC. Since 2015, all NHS trusts have been required to have a Freedom to Speak Up guardian, who are specially trained employees who support their colleagues to speak up about the things that are worrying them and that they feel unable to do so by other routes. Today, we're going to dive into the role in a little more detail, and I'm joined by two current Speak Up, Freedom to Speak Up guardians, and who also happen to be the co-chairs of the National Ambulance Network for Freedom to Speak Up guardians. A lot of titles getting thrown in already. I can see I'm going to get confused as we go through, but I'd like to welcome firstly Kim Blakeburn from South East Coast Ambulance and Lauren Dunn from Southwest Ambulance Service Trust. And Kim serves only as the Speak Up guardian, but Lauren is also the head of Wellbeing, as well as being this important role of the Freedom to Speak Up guardian. So let's start by really how you got into this role. So Kim, how did you become a Freedom to Speak Up guardian?
Thank you for the introduction, Karl, and for also giving Lauren and I the opportunity to come and talk to you today about speaking up in the ambulance service. It's a good question. I suppose why I became a guardian in the first place and then why I've chosen to stay in that role for the last 7 years are probably slightly different in their answers. So I started working at CCAM in the Emergency Operations Centre, which is coming on for about 13 years ago now, which has just flown by. And I moved from there to HR after a few years as an engagement advisor. And it was whilst I was in that role that I used to meet regularly with new starters, and they'd started to talk to me about issues that they were having as new members of staff, perhaps barriers that they were facing or issues with process. And I was assisting them almost as a separate add-on to my engagement role to navigate some of those barriers and signposting them to get through some of the process issues. And it was whilst I was doing that role that I first heard that CCAM were going to be going out to advert for a Freedom to Speak Up guardian. And in all honesty, I'd never heard of it. I was actually more intrigued at first, and without wishing to sound too flippant, the role to me sounded like it came with a cape, mask and underwear that you put on over your trousers. And so it was curiosity that made me Google what the role of FTSU guardian was. And obviously that then led me down a rabbit hole of information about mid-staffs and the Sir Robert Francis report and Helen Lee Donnelly and her role in speaking up in her organisation, that we know obviously eventually paved the way for so many others. And I just found the whole subject and the role fascinating. I've always loved working with people and really enjoyed helping those new starters navigate some of their issues. So the role sounded like it could be something that I might enjoy. But what I think is probably more important for me is why I'm still here after 7 years. And that boils down to the fact that I found myself in a role that I just feel so privileged every day to come and work and do. I often get told that I come across as very passionate when I'm talking about my job or talking about freedom to speak up. Whether or not it's meant in this way, I take that as a fabulous compliment. I am very passionate about my job. I care about it and it does matter to me. It's not always easy. At times we're supporting people through some of the most difficult times of their life. Facing matters like suicide or serious sexual assaults, and also the extreme fear that people can feel from speaking up. And that can be tough, alongside obviously the small pockets of resistance to change for whatever reason, which is another part of the role. My chief exec once told me when I'd had a tough day and felt like I was having to repeat myself to the same group of people, that the role of FTSU And any role that's working towards changing culture is a bit like painting the fourth bridge. You can do a sterling job, get to one end, and then have to start again. And that does feel very accurate at times. But I've never lost sight of the privileged position that I'm in every day, helping staff make a difference, however small, by assisting and supporting them to speak up. And that feels great. So, when we get to seek improvements and change from someone else's bravery to speak up, and I have a front row seat for some of that, it's something I don't see myself getting bored of. And so that's why I'm still here.
Right, fascinating. I suppose, Lauren, I'm going to come to you, and I'm just wondering whether it was the thought of the cape and the superhero mantle that encouraged you, or do you share the same sort of feelings as Kim?
It's such a privileged position, and I think that we are often supporting people as sometimes what feels like a last resort. They've been through other channels, they've escalated it through other avenues, they have felt unsupported, they feel at breaking point. And I think Freedom to Speak Up offers an avenue for a voice to be heard, for injustices to be spoken about, and for a platform which, like I said, sits outside of traditional routes that mean that we have an opportunity for improvement and change, because ultimately that's why somebody speaks up, because something doesn't feel right, and the hope and the aspiration for it to get better is where I think myself and Kim and the other Freedom to Speak Up guardians really solidify ourselves within. But for me, my driver really to come into the Freedom to Speak Up space happened, I would say, quite organically. It kind of evolved really. So I'm a social worker by background, and I have worked in a few different settings, and one of which was secure psychiatry in reference to forensic hospitals. And I remember watching the injustice sometimes and the poor treatment of patients. And that was learned behaviours from staff that perhaps have been institutionalised, perhaps power dynamics, and watching it and thinking, this is just so wrong. And I started to realise that I had a voice, and I could make it a safe environment for our patients and help our colleagues to learn and develop, because some of the issues in reference to the behaviours that they had are legacy, aren't they? We learn them, they're entrenched, the organisations may embed them, and culture change does not happen overnight, but change can happen in the moment, is my view, within us. And so it started very much from a patient safety perspective. Never heard of Freedom to Speak Up when I was in that role, moved into the ambulance service and was very privileged to work and look after our wellbeing service. And as time moved on, our wellbeing service started to identify individuals who were also raising concerns connected to their experience in the organisation, some of the experiences with our patients as well as our colleagues, and the environment that the organisation provided the conditions for people to thrive. And what it was really clearly showing is there was a deep connection between people raising concerns or feeling affected by work-related challenges and well-being, because you only raise a concern when something feels wrong. So that feeling wrong is then connected to personal impact, which often requires well-being support. So that was kind of my first inroad into Freedom to Speak Up. And it's kind of grown arms and legs and everything else in between since I started working in the Freedom to Speak Up space in 2021. It feels like a lifetime, but I guess coming back to Kim's point of I've been here 7 years. I haven't been in this role 7 years, but obviously Kim has. I've been in this role for some years now, but the reason that I keep doing it is because I really see the impact. I see the bravery. I see the culture change that happens. And so I know it works. It's just the bravery of people to come forward and put themselves in a really challenging position. I've been one of them. I've spoken up for, and it's rough and it's hard, but my goodness, I'm so thankful I did, because I saw the change that made. So a little bit different to where Kim started from, but I think very similar values around the importance of freedom to speak up.
Well, the only comment I can make to both of you is wow, because when we thought about this, and when I first, because I come from outside of the NHS, and when I first heard about the role, I was a bit cynical, I have to admit. And my then chair at the ambulance staff charity said, let's have a Freedom to Speak Up guardian. And I just went, OK, let's do that, because I just thought, OK. But firstly, from our perspective, it's been a great place for staff. I know staff have gone to the Freedom to Speak Up guardian, one of our trustees. I know that they've raised issues of concerns, and I've had gentle feedback, which has enabled us to drive our culture. But just listening to the two of you and your enthusiasm and the way that both of you link it really strongly, both to well-being, but also to culture change. And that's one of the things that's talked about a great deal in the ambulance service, which is, the need to change the culture to reflect. You hear concepts such as compassionate leadership, and I've seen that Welsh Ambulance Service Trust have today announced that they, on LinkedIn, that they are signing up to the Compassionate Leadership Pledge. And we hear a lot about the issues that the culture creates within the ambulance service. And so I'm really interested. Probably start with you again, Kim. Just a question really to give Lauren time to breathe a little bit after that enthusiastic description. But what do people actually come to you about without obviously breaching any confidences? But the range of things, I think you've both touched on them, but I think people might be interested in some examples.
Yeah, I mean it's tricky sometimes to share examples with details because as you'll know through the work that you do at TASC, a lot of the concerns that are raised, or the things that are talked about means that we're often protecting people's identity within that. But to give a sort of broader spectrum, people come to Freedom to Speak Up Guardians about anything that is affecting them at work. People issues are often messy and sometimes complex. So, some of that can get quite complicated, but it can range from, unsafe patient care, poor working conditions, bullying and harassment, leadership issues. We talked earlier on about sexual safety, which is a common theme that we see across the whole ambulance service. Down to just anything that doesn't feel quite right. And yeah, so the range of sort of concerns that come through Freedom to Speak Up are really from I suppose things that can be I think Lauren mentioned just now that sort of the quick change, things that can be dealt with quite easily and just through someone being brave enough in the first place to say, I'm feeling this is happening. Sometimes it can be just a simple breakdown in relationship between them and their line management, and they feel that they just are really unsure about how to deal with that. So they'll come to Freedom to Speak Up and maybe just ask a bit of advice. And it can be as simple as us arranging for mediation to be put in place for that to be resolved, which is a really nice outcome, to things that are far more complicated and may even end up in court. Like some of the really serious sexual safety concerns that we've handled through FTSU. So yeah, there's a whole range of things that can come through. I suppose not dissimilar to the sort of calls that you will take at TASC. That I also think that there are some similarities in what we do. I've listened to some of the podcasts as well, and whilst I haven't had to contact TASC myself, we at Freedom to Speak Up across the ambulance service will obviously, often recommend that as an avenue for people, because being listened to and heard is sometimes the most important thing that someone is looking for.
That's really interesting, because I think there are parallels between what we do and people come to us because we're seen as being, firstly, independent. Yes. We're not attached, and confidential, so we don't talk back. And I think, Lauren, I'm sure you have the same range of issues, but one of the things that I'm quite interested in is how do you, Lauren, ensure that you are seen and actually are independent of the management of the trust, because that's got to be one of the key parts, because from what you've both described, people speak up about things that don't feel right, and they're obviously coming to you potentially, and correct me if I'm wrong in this assumption, but come to you because they feel, for whatever reason, there can be a range of reasons, they can't go and talk to their line manager or a higher up, or they're afraid to. So Lauren, how do you ensure that you are seen and actually are able to be independent and confidential, and what challenges, this will be for both of you really, what challenges does that create for you?
I think it's really complex because when myself, Kim, and the other Freedom to Speak Up Guardians are all independent and impartial. We're trained in that way by the National Guardian's Office, and we have confidential systems that mean that our data and information aren't accessible by other individuals in the organisation. And our role is to support individuals to be able to raise their concerns. So it is really tricky. We are a standalone department, as I said. We have our own systems and processes. And we put the person right at the core of what we do. I often say, you're in control. We are here to hear what you have to say. And we are going to help you to think of ideas of how you escalate that or what that might look like. And in collaboration with that individual, we will look at what that looks like. We're always very, very honest about autonomy. So understandably, raising concerns is really, really hard, really difficult. And for many people, they fear what might happen when they do raise concerns. So often we find that people come to us wanting to remain anonymous through the process, but through our engagement and our conversation and building trust and relationships, often people feel more able then to raise things confidentially with their names associated to it and consent being given. So we would always seek consent, and we work with the individuals to raise their concerns in whichever avenue they feel is most appropriate. And it might be that it's a case that it's escalated to the local manager, to HR, to our people partner function, but we do that in combination with the individual. So alongside supporting them from that independent, impartial, we don't have views and opinions on their concerns. We're there as a listening ear. We are there to help build relationships, and we're there to help build an understanding and awareness that raising concerns is a gift. And that we are there to support them through that process. So it's complex in the sense that people often have those natural fears and barriers to raising concerns, but it's also complex in the sense of ensuring our organisation responds appropriately to when somebody is brave enough to raise a concern, because that's the other bit. And part of that comes down to awareness, understanding, fear as well. Feedback is hard to receive, isn't it? Let's be honest. Nobody likes a bit of feedback, but actually it can be the making of people. It can absolutely be the making of people, but it's about how do you help the organisation outside of people raising concerns to grow that growth mindset, to build the conditions through our policies, through our processes, through our leadership development. That golden thread of psychological safety is I guess where I'm leading to. How do we help the organisation so that when people do raise concerns, that they are thanked, that they are valued, and that those concerns actually lead to change.
That's really quite interesting, because I was reflecting as you were talking, Lauren, about the way in which we actually go about it, because we touched on the issue of sexual safety a few times in the conversation, which is quite a live topic. And I know that you're both aware that about 3 months ago, TASC launched its own sexual safety initiative, and we were very keen to make links into all of the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians across each of the trusts, recognising the vital role that is there, but also recognising, I think, some of the similarities. And we set out our stall very much not to be an advocate, but to be a listening ear in the first place, to accept and help people to reflect, but also to encourage people to take the appropriate steps and do the right thing, whatever the right thing is. And it's not for us to determine. I think that's really critical. But one of the challenges we have faced, I think, and this, Kim, I'd be interested in your views on this, of course. One of the challenges we faced is often we were worried that things would be reported to us that went into the realms where we then had to do something. I'm thinking of safeguarding concerns, for example, or potentially disclosing of criminal offences. And I'm wondering how probably both of you, but start with you, Kim, how you deal with those conflicts.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and actually it links on to something that Lauren was just saying. So we do have those conversations when people first come to us as guardians and explain that, you know, they're in control, and we use the term at CCAM, you know, we're not here to bulldoze, this is your concern, we'll walk you through it, talk you through the options. But of course, there are times where you know, the law dictates to us what should happen next. And I think one of the key things for us, and if we're talking specifically about sexual safety concerns here, is to be absolutely honest from the get-go. And that's something that we all do as guardians, not just us at CCAM and Lauren, but across the ambulance service and the wider NHS. It's really important that guardians are really honest with people. You know, I said right at the very beginning, sometimes people are coming to us with what might be one of the most difficult times of their life. And that is particularly true when it comes to things like sexual safety and sexual misconduct in the workplace, because there's a feeling of shame that's often connected to that, and really deep-rooted fears as to what's going to happen next. So any unexpected move can really make things feel a lot worse. And the whole point of coming to Freedom to Speak Up is to try and make the process feel a bit safer and a bit easier. And the only way that you can do that is right from the beginning, have really honest conversations about what this might look like next. You know, when certain things are raised through sexual safety, it might identify a risk for other people and for, you know, not just people in the workplace, but for patients too. And that means that there's certain duties that we're obligated to take, you know, in terms of sort of next steps when it comes to hearing that concern. I have found in my experience, I have heard a lot of sexual safety concerns across the 7 years of doing this job. And I have found that being honest and explaining to people what those next steps might look like and supporting people through those has meant that by and large people are then able to take those steps slightly more confidently than they would have been, I think. So for me, the point is, and it goes back to something that Lauren just said, it's about being really honest from the start. Obviously, you know, confidentiality is absolutely important, but at times, you know, that can't be honoured, and explaining that from the start is really important.
I assume you would echo all of that, Lauren.
Oh, absolutely. And I think consent is also really, really important, because we often find, you know, one of the challenges we find organisationally, and I'm certain many organisations struggle with this, is the understanding of confidentiality and what would be classed as a breach or not. And when that happens, you know, data protection, GDPR, privacy, all those types of things. And one of the things we're working on at the moment as a Freedom Speak Up team with some of our areas is around this want and desire from leaders to make sure somebody's supported, but in doing that sometimes leads to an unintentional breach of confidentiality. So for example, you're going off on leave, you're supporting somebody in your team that's going through quite a complex situation at the moment, and with all the right want, desire, will, you've just let your other managers know in that team that this is going on for that person, because you want to know that when you're not there, that person is supported. So it comes from the right place, but to the individual, that is a huge violation of trust, confidentiality, and leads to sometimes coming through to us in the guardian space. And so it comes back to that education and the awareness. I see that as a real vital role for the Freedom to Speak Up space and team. It isn't just about dealing with concerns, it's about supporting leadership in changing culture at the core, because in a way, the hearing concerns is the reactive piece. The proactive piece is the foundations. So that's the other component, I think, that links to Kim's point.
Again, really powerful, and both of you come across very authentic in the way that you're presenting with, the confidentiality, the consent, the permission, etc. But also recognizing, as we do sometimes, it's not possible to hold that line, and you need, sometimes for statutory reasons, sometimes because you've just got to do it because it's the right thing to do, and it's a really difficult judgment call. One of the things that I'm interested in is, because I said earlier on, I didn't know much about the role, and since my first conversation with Kim, and then the opportunity to come to the national group and talk to, it's been quite an educative journey for me, and we increasingly see linking in with your roles across each of the trusts as being a vital part of what we do, because clearly you're there and part of the system, but separate from the system in that way. I think that's really important. So how do you think we can go about, maybe collaboratively, helping people to understand your role a little bit more, particularly people who come from outside the NHS, what it's there for? So is there anything that we can do or you can do to actually promote the role a little bit more? Either of you, really.
Can I jump in first?
Absolutely.
Just a few little ideas here. So I think one of the biggest things is around how we collectively can break down barriers. There are lots of barriers, and some of them are barriers that unfortunately come from a place of reality and previous experiences. And there are also barriers that we can absolutely break down just through conversation. So I think that's the first thing. But how we do that is another question, isn't it? But I think collectively breaking down barriers is really, really important. I think the second part is ensuring that organisations embrace freedom to speak up and make that BAU, and I do see that being collaboration. We have our National Guardians Office that helps that. We have the Ambulance Association of Chief Executives. We have yourselves from TASC, and as a collective, you're a stronger force, aren't you, together, that allows for change. But I guess the biggest thing that we struggle with as an organisation, and Kim, I'd be interested to know if you have this challenge as well, and you might as well, Karl, in TASC, is about how you share impact and lived experience, certainly in this space where it is a really difficult space to be brutally honest about your experiences, good, bad, or indifferent. But by sharing impact and lived experiences, it can empower and break down barriers for other colleagues to feel safe, to be able to raise concerns, to be part of that culture change and be part of that movement. So we've always struggled with that in many ways because we're a confidential service. We have to recognise the privacy of not only those who've raised concerns, but those who've had concerns raised about them. And so navigating that bit is really complex, but we've started to do that in our organisation through our Just and Learning Culture forums, through our Freedom Speak Up month, and through our normal avenues of governance, so our people committees and our board reports. But I do think that is something collaboratively we can do, and it's about how we support one another. I'm certain people come through to you in TASC and talk about such an array of challenges within the workplace, and it's about having the ability to say, have you looked on the website to find your Freedom Speak Up Guardian? Have you do you know who yours is in your area? And building that collaboration through that. So I don't know, Kim, if you experienced similar things in reference to sharing stories.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So coming to your point about the sharing of lived experience, I think is something that guardians across the whole network, across the NHS find really challenging. And also there's a responsibility, isn't there, that comes with hearing these concerns, some of which can be really difficult to hear, and having the responsibility of being the conduit for that person, and ensuring that I'm going to use the term do their story justice, but I'm not sure if that's the right term to use, but you'll understand sort of where I'm going from. One of the things that we've done in the past is, and absolutely it's something that I'm looking to explore again for the future because it was really impactful, is having somebody that agreed to share their story with a closed session at the board. So obviously there's the public board that meet, and then they often have like a closed board session. And in the past, we have had, it's happened twice before, somebody come in to share their story. And actually, two different types. So one time was somebody that had a story that didn't end with a good result, and they didn't feel that they had been heard or taken seriously, and they came and shared that experience in the closed session at the board, and that really helped to sort of I suppose spark that curiosity that we're often talking about. And we've also had someone share a story in the past where actually things went really well and they had a really good outcome, and that helps to encourage further enthusiasm for the Speak Up service and for promoting Speak Up service. So all of the things that you've already suggested, I think, are great, putting examples in the board report and things like that. But yeah, that lived experience one was sharing at the board session was quite useful. And I would also say that it's a really interesting point that you made, Karl, about how we get out and how we sort of let people know that we're here, I suppose, really, and how we encourage people to come and speak to us. And one thing I would say is that, again, across the board, Freedom Speak Up Guardians can be, and Freedom Speak Up teams, I think, as well, can be really innovative about how we go out and encourage people to speak up and let people know about how we're there to support them. And one of the other things that we do at CCAM is we have created workshops for our university students. So we go and visit all our linked universities every year. So we meet with year two students and year 3 students every year, and there's a different workshop for each for the year 2 and then for the year 3s, but we are able to have really good honest conversations with them about what Freedom Speak Up is and how it looks, and what speaking up is like in the ambulance service and why it's important, and all of the sort of things that we've sort of touched upon today. So those sort of workshops and local leadership workshops, you've mentioned yourself about the cynicism that you felt, which is completely understandable, and we hear about it all the time, and it'll be a familiar subject for Lauren as well. There's a cynicism from leaders, and there's often a fear from leadership as well. Being faced with something that might make people feel a bit uncomfortable about maybe a decision that they've made, or a decision that one of their team has made, can be really challenging. So Lauren's absolutely right that what we do isn't just about supporting the people at speaking up level, it's also about encouraging that culture within our organisation. So working with our leadership teams and really trying to embed the right mindset in how to sort of hear concerns and respond to concerns is also really important. So going out and meeting with those local teams and having those conversations and local leadership workshops is also a really important way of doing that, alongside regularly meeting with our networks and things like this podcast as well.
Things like this podcast. I think it's, firstly, we're really pleased to be part of the conversation and part of the work that's actually promoting it. And I've just been thinking, whilst you were both talking about how we've positioned Freedom to Speak Up Guardians on our webpage, and we've got you in the sexual safety. But of course, as you've both said, you do a great deal more of that. So we're going to move the contact details and the information. We'll have it in 2 places because it's important people see the range of what you're doing. The question about how we demonstrate impact, and interesting, that was going to be one of my next questions, which is, but I'll answer it first, about we firstly seek permission for people. We're always trying to encourage people, because actually what people really need to see to understand that breaks down the barriers is to see that people like them, whatever that means, people doing the job, paramedics, are having these struggles, are using this mechanism, have found a route and have actually come through it, which is really key. It is hard to find that. It is hard to demonstrate impact without breaching confidentiality. But one of the things we try and do is to be I actually hate this expression, but I'm going to use it, a learning organisation. Um, old Peter Senge and all of that stuff, really quite interesting, and telling us what to do. But with the way that we apply that is actually to never develop a service or an approach to how we do things without talking to people with lived experience, without finding out from them what it is that they want and what are the barriers that have stopped them coming forward. And this came out particularly powerfully within the exploration we did around sexual safety. And that one of the things that came out really strongly from, and we spoke to a very wide group, was that sometimes you just want it to stop, and you don't necessarily want the individual that is causing the problem, because it's perhaps banter that's out of control, it's certain behaviors, a style of joke, which are very important and often can be very difficult to deal with. Want them to stop, but not necessarily to get into trouble, to be sacked, to be disciplined. And we heard that when an organisation goes, and this example wasn't from within the ambulance service, but when an organisation goes, we have a zero tolerance policy. If someone's accused, they're off the site straight away, because that isn't what people often wanted. So we try and listen, and the impact that we have to individuals, we try and learn from how we achieve that and feed it back in and encourage it. The other thing we try and do a great deal is when we develop the promotional material for things that we do, with the 24/7 suicide crisis line that we run for the ambulance staff. We really worked hard. We got imagery that was actual real people working within the ambulance service, not necessarily people who'd had suicide ideation, but people who felt comfortable enough to be the faces of the campaign. We also got the photographs taken by a former paramedic, and those two combinations created an authenticity of the image, the view, the experience that actually spoke more than 1,000 words ever could. So we try all sorts of things, and we produce reports and data and so on. But I think for us, what we're always struggling to do, and I think I'd like to sort of ask you both is almost the penultimate part of this course, is we try and come up with examples where we've done something that's made a positive difference. And that's difficult without the permission of the individuals often. But can either of you, or can you think of an example where you've actually, through what you've heard, driven organizational change that's not only benefited the organization, but has also benefited the individual? And I think both of you talked about feeding back into policies and processes, which is really key. So just an example that you can share so people can see the impact that you as guardians actually have.
Would you like me to start, Kim?
Absolutely,
I can think of
yeah.
something with our
Yes.
student paramedics. I think the thing is, Karl, one of the challenges with it, I'll come back to the student paramedic bit in a minute, is that often we're one part of the change. So, for example,
Yes.
policy change, we might be the person who brings it to the attention of the people partner because the individual who raised a concern has raised something connected to perhaps a new maternity policy or a policy that doesn't quite sit right. But we're not the people that make the change. We're just there part of it. So it's often about collaboration, I would say, at the core of it. But I think back to, I think it was about 2021, as an organisation, we had some concerns raised around some of the experience of our learners, our students, when they were coming to us on placement. And a massive piece of work was undertaken, quite rightly, by the organisation around improving that, recognising that the experiences that they shared were not what we would want, what would align to our values and our behaviours. And that absolutely, we didn't just need to, but we wanted to ensure that our future workforce was coming into an environment that was safe and healthy and inclusive and supportive. So there was a lot of work around sexual safety at that time. That's when it started for us as an organisation. I think we launched our own sexual safety charter before the NHS launched theirs. I think we launched ours in the February, and the NHS launched theirs in the October. So we were already on the front foot slightly with it. And we talked a lot about organisationally what we could do for our leaders. But as the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian in the room, I said, well, what are we actually going to do for our students? Like, how do we give them tangible skills to say that isn't all right, know where that line is, understand what is appropriate in reference to relationships and banter? So we work with an external organisation called Wellity Global. Me and Kim were talking about them the other day, weren't we? And they developed a really fantastic programme called Creating Positive Relationships that we have delivered to our year 2 students for the last 3 years, with significant increase in learning outcomes, knowledge development, but also tangible skills to protect themselves when they are in situations that fall out of line with what we would expect of our values and behaviours, and feeling more safe and able to put up their hand saying there's a patient safety concern. And it has been really incredibly impactful. But the thing that I think comes to transformative culture change is that this year we've also started doing it with our leaders. And there's no point just doing it with a group of individuals in the organisation. It's about how we embed that. I talked about that golden thread, didn't I? How do we make everyone start from the same starting point? So equity in some ways, knowledge equity, let's go with that. So we've used that this year as a bit of a trial and a pilot, again with profound significant success, and we're going to be looking at how we embed that into our leadership development now in the organisation moving forward. So I guess it started with the experience of our learners to now looking at that organisational shift around inappropriate behaviours, attitudes, and tangible ways of preventing that.
Right. Sounds really fascinating because the learners, as you say, you did a couple of things, talked a couple of things there. One is this development of life skills, and I was talking to someone the other day about, and it made me think back to when I was 18 to 21, very long time ago, and lots of people expect you to just go and get a degree, get the qualification, and then to become fully formed into the role of this label across your forehead of paramedic or whatever it may be. And you're not. And the one thing that often we forget as individuals is we think it's quite normal to go to the gym or to go running and take care of our bodies, but we don't actually build our personalities, our life skills, our ability to form relationships. We sort of decide, well, we can either do it or we can't. And if you can't do these things, then there's something wrong with it. It's not true at all. And I think that's really interesting. Would love to learn more, Lauren, about that program and what you're doing. Because at TASC, we actually want to move in a sensible way more towards actually dealing with the causes rather than the issue where we can. And I think that's really important. Kim, anything from you?
Yeah, it's so interesting because Laura and I have been speaking about Wellity recently, so definitely something I'd like to explore more. But yeah, I suppose the collaboration side of things that Lauren talked about is so important. I mean, more broadly speaking, in terms of sort of our learning outcomes and how we can achieve those and then share them. Sometimes when broader themes are identified, a bit like the one that Lauren was just talking about, we've recently started really working alongside our OD organisational development teams, and bringing them alongside also QI to sort of really help us draw out some of the sort of key issues, because like Lauren said, we're often the conduit for this part of the solution, but really working alongside the other important parts of the organisation to really draw out the recommendations and the learning and the outcomes is important. And then starting to find ways to let staff know about those changes is also really important. And so we're putting them onto our zone, which is our intranet system, as well, so that people can see the differences that are made, where we're able to sort of identify them, the differences without identifying people. And one of the other things that we've done at CCAM as well, which has been really useful, is we have created a dashboard. So we use a system called Power BI, and it has really transformed the way that we are able to have conversations with leadership, both local leadership and senior leadership across the organisation, because we're sort of speaking their language in a way. So what we are able to do is show that. So more recently, we've seen a really significant increase in the amount of concerns that are closed with a satisfactory outcome. So we can see year on year the percentage of improvements that are made, and also we can start to see changes in, for example, we're starting to see anonymous reporting going up. So exploring that and looking at perhaps why that might be happening, and putting the support in a proactive way rather than just being sort of reactive to these things is really key, I think, in making a difference to the culture change. So that's also been a really useful way for us to sort of identify improvements using data that really sings to operational leadership.
That's really quite impressive, and I think it is how, I was thinking as we throughout this conversation, the work that you do and the work that we do as well, as we said, is broadly similar. But there's something about being able to communicate that to the people who are the ones that should be driving it and are responsible for driving the change in a way that works with their language, their environment. And I often think within the ambulance service and many organisations, public sector organisations, you've got this huge challenge of firstly funding and budgets and everything else. Secondly, within the ambulance service, you've got the way in which the demand for ambulances has changed, what people call them for, etc. The impact of changes in GP and primary care support, A&E pressures, etc., and all of the top-down targets. And it's really interesting to hear how you're driving change by protecting the people who are going to be the future, but also how you're reporting on that change in a way that fits in with what senior management are often looking at. I think it's the sort of the two-way approach. It has been the most interesting. I'm looking at conversation that we've had when we started this. We go into questions, but so much is just flown off the page. And I think the key takeaway for me from this is how we at TASC can continue to work with you as a collective group, how we can promote the work that you can do, but actually how we can learn from each other, how we deal with this concept of how we demonstrate impact, because people will only use things that they think are going to make a difference. And sometimes people come to our sorts of organizations and they disappear into our grasp, and we never tell anybody what we've actually done and what we've achieved. But I think that's a really good challenge. I'm going to finish with one thing that always interests me. One of the things that we do quite a lot, because I sit on the sexual safety helpline. I do my bit on the rota. And when we set this up, one of the things we're hugely conscious about is what we as individuals, what team members will be hearing, having disclosed, and we work quite hard as a collective to support each other. And your teams are in similar positions. So where do you get your strength from? It's obviously enthusiasm from the role, but basically you're sitting there listening to people's problems, difficulties, issues, concerns all day. So just one tip that I'll share one too. Before that, I don't think it's fair to put you on. I go and sit in a darkened corner for 2 hours just to recharge, because although people are surprised, this thing, Myers-Briggs, I'm actually an introvert in Myers-Briggs terms, and I get my energy not from engaging with people, but from actually sitting in quiet corners, which allows me to recharge. So I go and find a quiet place just to sit. What tips do you have for how you keep yourselves fresh, enthusiastic, and actually really authentic when you're dealing with people? Because if you're jaded and you're tired and it's very hard to be authentic sometimes. So, Kim.
Yeah, there's a few things actually I would say. So one of the more simpler things that I do is take my dog for a walk. Sometimes I'm lucky to live next to some lovely woodlands, and sometimes just taking 20 minutes in the day just to walk outside in the fresh air if it's not pouring with rain, for example, and sort of clearing your head and finding a bit of space is one of the things that I'll do. We also have supervision, external supervision, which is really useful to be able to offload some of the more difficult things and challenging stuff that comes through freedom to speak up. And then the other two things I'll mention is, firstly, the National Ambulance Network. We have a network of guardians where we are so supportive of each other, and for the whole time that I've done this job, the network have been there, and obviously Lauren and I co-chair that network now. It is just as important to me now as it was when I first started out as a guardian. That level of support I get from my fellow guardians is just as important to me as it was when I was brand new. And then I'll embarrass Lauren slightly, but the other thing is Lauren, I find I'm incredibly privileged to work alongside Lauren as my co-chair, and you can hear how great and supportive she is. So I will often dip into sort of calling Lauren and messaging her, and if things are really tough, and just having a really supportive conversation with somebody that I know understands. So sorry to embarrass you, Lauren, but that is that is the truth. So they're the things that I do. But I haven't mentioned the wine, but that is something on a Friday night that also gets used as well.
Very good. Lauren, if you can cope with the embarrassment.
I'm not going to lie, Kim, that was lovely of you to say, but I think that is a joint feeling. I feel very, very lucky to work alongside Kim in the network co-chair role, and have certainly felt a safe place with Kim. And I think that's what's crucial here. I've got a few things like Kim has about what keeps me safe and sane. I'm going to call it that in this role, because we unfortunately often see the worst side of organisations and people. So I think connections is absolutely at the core. So the network, our wonderful working relationship, Kim, but also my team are my safe place, and I say that to them all the time. They are the people that keep me going, and I hope that I'm part of the group of people that keep them going. So it's again collaboration. Quality of life is a huge driver for me, massive driver. Ever since I even was interested in being a social worker, it was, how do I influence somebody's quality of life? And so that's a big driver for me, being kind to myself, and going to the gym. I've really got into the gym over the recent years, and have found it as such a wonderful place for decompression. But I think the final part that keeps me driven, if I'm honest, and keeps me well, is I'm a very determined character, if you guys haven't realised. And I just can't bear injustice. And so that for me is a huge driving force for what does keep me well, passionate, and motivated in this space.
Thank you both for sharing, because I think it's one of those things that is often forgotten. We touched in the conversation. I sometimes think that we assume that the people in particular roles are looked after and able to cope with this, and forget that they're also human beings who have the same issues, both in work, personally, etc., that everyone else does. So I think it's important that people know that the people who are supporting them are supported as well, because I think that's part of, to go back to a previous theme, part of actually making sure that people feel comfortable to coming to you, to feel that they're not just giving you a burden which you can't cope with. They're really good. I'm really disappointed to sort of have to bring this to an end, but I'm conscious of our listeners, but this has been really, really interesting conversation, and hopefully for you as well, because I'm learning a huge amount. And I think one thing that I hadn't realized perhaps enough when we started this conversation or even thought about doing this is how important this role is in terms of driving cultural change and transformation, and the links very clearly with well-being, not only of the individuals, but of the organization as a whole collectively. And I think that's a really strong thing for me that you've both got across really, really strongly, because I'm sure a lot of people look at it and go, oh, that's just a role for people to go and have a whinge and a moan. And, all you do all day, and I think we put that right, is listen to people. So I'm really, really pleased, and I'm determined that we at TASC will continue to work with you both as individuals, but also collectively across the country to make people aware of what you do and how you do it, to make people aware of the impact that you are having, and to work with you to amplify the awareness of your service. And I think I'm going to do in a few weeks' time, I'm going to talk to the St George's University cohort of students at their Emergency Services Wellbeing Day. And I've just decided to put a slide into my presentation which talks about this role. And I might even give you a nod, Lauren, for the way that you've taken it forward. Quite happy to do that. Really good. Thank you both. I hope it's been as enjoyable for you as it has been for me. And thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Kim. And thank you to all of those that have listened. Thank you.